So good afternoon, everyone, and oops, I'm throwing this on the floor here. It's an honor to be here in Williamsburg, at William and Mary. I am an alum, and some of my classmates are here, at least one, Scott Stanton. I saw him earlier. There he is. Hi. He's hiding. And to see so many people from the Commonwealth that I worked with over the past 3 years who taught me a tremendous amount, and one of the many people leading that pack is certainly Elizabeth Andrews. And while this may have already been said today, I wasn't here, so I will say it again, which is to thank her for her incredible and incomparable work for the Commonwealth, not only as the director of the Virginia Coastal Policy Center, but working in DEQ, working in the Attorney General's office. She is the premier environmental lawyer, certainly a treasure for this state. She has an encyclopedic knowledge of Virginia code, and I can tell you that if you're working on legislation or trying to make policy, and you know nothing about Virginia code, which is the category I was in, knowing someone like Elizabeth who can basically recite it all for you at the drop of a hat and find what she doesn't know on her phone in about 2 seconds is extremely, extremely helpful and beneficial, and I've learned such a tremendous amount from her and from so many other people here, and I'm still learning, and I'm still grateful for this opportunity and this experience. Elizabeth, in particular, thank you for all that you've done. Again, I know you're stepping down, not away, and I want to make that very clear, but I'm honored to have served with you, and know we will stay in touch, and hope you don't go far. So, I'll say thank you. Because your work is not done. There is still so much more to be done in this world, in the things that you do. So moving to the Maritime Administration, thank you to Professor Elizabeth Andrews and Dr. Kay Floyd. Kay, thank you for asking me to join you today on behalf of Secretary Buttigieg, the Biden-Harris administration, and the Department of Transportation. I'm thrilled to talk a little about what we do in the Maritime Administration, particularly in the context of resilience and improving our national security capacity in that regard. I want to first take a few moments to talk about what MARAD does, because I find that most people have absolutely no idea. And I was one of those people, and even when I thought I knew, I really didn't know, so I'll run through this quickly just to give everyone some background. Our mission is to foster, promote, and develop the maritime industry of the United States to ensure our nation's economic and national security needs are met. We actually predate the Department of Transportation as an entity. Something MARAD-like existed as early as the mid-1914, 1915 time frame. It has changed over the years to be many different things. At one point, it included the Federal Maritime Commission, which some of you may be aware of, regulates the industry to some extent. We do not regulate. We are operational and promotional. And in that sense, have our feet in really 2 different departments, one in DOD, one in DOT. We run and operate a ready reserve force of 45 ships going to 50. If you see gray-hulled ships down here in Newport News with a red, white, and blue stripe on their stack, they belong to me. There's another one, the right is very near to NOB. You may see her there. These ships are ready to support the Transportation Command's needs, in addition to our U.S. flag fleet, which is 85 privately owned, internationally trading vessels, to move the nation's goods as needed, particularly to ensure we carry 100% of DoD cargo, 50% of all other agencies' cargoes, as required by law. What this is really for is in time of crisis to be able to move our national security forces, Department of Defense, forward as needed, and to sustain sea lift over time. Think World War II, bullets, beans, black oil. We keep this fleet in reserve that would, in time of war, support or time of need of any sort by the nation, support our commercial fleet in moving our nation's goods where they needed to go to support our interests. So that is funded by the Department of Defense. It includes a number of programs. But the real point here is these vessels are aging and elderly. Some are older than I am. Many are steam. We have the largest steam-powered fleet in the world. The good news is I'm a steam engineer. The bad news is people my age are steam engineers. So that should tell you something about the age of the vessels. We are in the process of recapitalizing them, extending their service life, and buying used vessels that will be new to us that are newer to recapitalize this fleet. So that's a big chunk of what we do, largely DoD funded, $809 million. The other $1.4 billion does two things. It supports a large port infrastructure development program, which I will talk about today. That's a big piece of what that funding is for under the bipartisan infrastructure law. And also, it supports the Maritime Academy. Kings Point, U.S. Maritime Academy, belongs to the Maritime Administration. We are, in essence, their service. And so much similar size to the Coast Guard Academy, about 1,000 students, a little bit less, focused on providing strategic sea lift officers in support, again, of our nation's national security needs, and graduating about 240 or so licensed mariners, third mates, third engineers every year to support our U.S. flag fleet needs. In addition to state maritime academies, there are 6 of them. We don't own them, they're run by states, but we support them as well. So we are building ships now. We haven't built ships since 1961. We're building a series of 5 training vessels in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. This kind of gets to some infrastructure comments I'll make in a few minutes. But these vessels will be used, they're dual mission. They will be used to train mariners at the 5 of the 6 state maritime academies, and they are also, as national assets, available for the nation to use should they need them. Think FEMA, think hurricane response, think humanitarian assistance, disaster response, defense support to civil authorities, or some other need. So they have kind of a dual mission here, in addition to helping to keeping the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in the shipbuilding business, which has been very successful. So I mentioned port infrastructure development, and in particular, I think that is something that ties into what we're thinking about today here, what you've been talking about, at least in some way. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, MARAD will receive, or has received, over the course of 5 years, an additional $2.25 billion to support port infrastructure development. That, coupled with an appropriation we already were receiving, which is about $230 million a year, combined is our port infrastructure development grant program. For those who care, the notice of funding opportunity is posted and the grants close this year, April 28th. So if you know somebody who's writing one, April 28th is the day for them. So what is the intent of this effort? I can tell you words that are said to me by ports who are recipients of this grant, that it is a once-in-a-generation investment in our port infrastructure nationwide. Blue water port infrastructure, places like Norfolk, and brown water, rivers, coastal traffic, Great Lakes. The need is extensive. We typically receive more than 5 times the amount of money on offer in applications. That's true of all of our grant programs. Last year, we awarded $703 million in funding for this program, the $450 under the bipartisan infrastructure law, plus the additional funding that was appropriated to us. It went to 41 grants in 22 states and 1 territory. Grants are in a number of categories. They can be for large ports or small ports. The specific criteria is focused on improving the movement of goods. And for a large port, they must have a positive BCA, or a BCA of greater than 1 benefit cost analysis. Very focused on, in addition, other conditions. And these conditions, which are not statutory requirements, are part of the consideration, that being climate resilience, natural hazard resilience, equity, and workforce development, job and wealth creation within the surrounding communities. Of the grants that were awarded last year, 60% went to communities that are historically underserved and disadvantaged. And I can say that we were not tracking that particularly as we were choosing. It turned out to be that way because so many ports are already in areas that are extremely disadvantaged and under-resourced, and are suffering from pollution and the many other things that come with being a community adjacent to a port. So 60% went to communities that were in that category, which is good. That is part of the point. About 100 million went to ports that are supporting offshore wind. That isn't a statutory criteria, but ports that are supporting offshore wind can absolutely apply, and that is something that is a consideration. And we do take into account how the industry is moving so that we are not ahead of where leases have been let already or where partnerships have been built up, so that there's we're tracking with the industry, not getting too far ahead of it. I can also say from talking to some of the smaller ports, Great Lakes and some of the riverine ports, we gave a grant to a port in Oklahoma, Muskogee, that those opportunities in small ports, people actually cry when they talk about what they come in to see us, and they thank us for giving them, for realizing their need for, of course, they had to write a good grant, they have to meet the criteria, but the impact that has on their communities and their workforce and their opportunities to improve their capacity is a generational change for them, and so that is the whole point of this effort. The other thing I can say here is that, and I'll use John Picari's words, our first port envoy, now General Lyons is in that port and supply chain envoy capacity. He was former Transcom, but John Picari, former Port of Baltimore director, was the first. And he asked me a couple of months ago, what were we seeing? This was before this year's grants notice of funding opportunity went out. It was post last year's awards. What were we seeing as consistent themes across the grants? And what kinds of projects was what he really wanted to know. And the word he used was, I suspect you're doing a lot of triage. And that is exactly what we are doing. Most of the large grants that come in are fixing things that are so desperately broken that they can't be used right now. And my latest example of that, I was in Houston until some ridiculous hour late last night trying to get home through the thunderstorms. But I visited the Port of Beaumont for a couple of reasons. We have fleet site there. We have a lot of ready reserve force vessels in that area. But we also gave Beaumont a port grant last year, and I wanted to see what they were all about. In addition to the grant they received from us last year, which is really focusing on a container on barge project they're doing and expanding a container yard they have, we'd given them a RAISE grant in the past, which is a different DoD level grant system. And that grant is helping them restore one of their main wharfs. The reason it needed to be restored is because one morning they came to work and it had collapsed into the river, literally collapsed overnight. And so what I should say about Beaumont is that Beaumont is one of our most active strategic ports that DoD specifically has targeted and designated to move the Army, predominantly, Army's goods out when they need to depart and to bring them back in when they return from wherever they have been deployed to around the world. Beaumont is the leader in doing that. We're taking some new ships from the Military Sealift Command. They're not new, they're old, but they're new to us. LMSRs, very, very large ro-ros, very large. The Mendonca is one that we took about 3 months ago. They've been transferred to us. They were immediately sent on deployment. She was in Beaumont yesterday, loaded to the gills with tanks and trucks and all kinds of other equipment that was actually returning from an overseas deployment. So you can see how busy that port is, and to have the juxtaposition of that ship and all of that cargo there across the split ship, across the harbor from, that's a good way to put it, across the slip is the word I'm looking for, from a collapsed pier that is now heavily under construction and being restored. That kind of puts it all in perspective as to the kinds of things we need to do here to improve our infrastructure, and we need to do them rapidly. Typically, out of the PIDP grant awards over time, about 25% of them go to strategic ports without anyone specifically targeting that, and the Secretary, as a statutory requirement, may consider a strategic port as an additional criteria in making or determining grant awards. So a lot going on here in PIDP. This year we have $662 million on offer, a little bit less, but what I encourage people to do when asked is please apply. Virginia has been a recipient in the past. They received a grant in 2021 to work on the Portsmouth Marine Terminal to support offshore wind capacity and expanding offshore wind capacity at that terminal. We also awarded, I talked about offshore wind grants, but about $100 million went to offshore wind grants or grants related to offshore wind infrastructure improvement last year. So I talked about Beaumont and the container on barge work there, but getting eyes on it yesterday was certainly an amazing opportunity. But other strategic ports, Jacksport has received a large grant last year to expand their capacity, another key departure site from the East Coast, and largely Marine Corps focused. And then Alaska, the Port of Anchorage desperately needed key support for everything that comes into that state. And of course, we have Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson up there, one of our most strategic facilities. All of their equipment comes and goes through the Port of Alaska. So tremendous amount of work to be done there as well. I should talk about other programs that we have in that context, thinking about broadening our capacity nationwide and building resilience from a strategic perspective. One is our Marine Highway Program, much smaller program, received under BIL an additional $25 million last year, which brought it up to $40 million on offer. This year we're back to our regular or standard appropriation, which is only $10 million. So with some extra grant money that we have not been able to use, we have $12.3 million on offer this year. Also closes April 28th. There have been some changes to this program. For those of you who may not know what it essentially mirrors our highway system, but on the water, nationwide, blue water and brown water, including overseas ports, and the intent is initially to improve the movement of cargo by sea, which is highly underutilized, to get trucks off of roads and to give more capacity to rail to move other things. Last year, the name of the program was changed to the U.S. Marine Highway Program, and also the focus on containers, moving containers exclusively, was also changed. We can now award grants under this program to ports that move liquids or that move bulk cargo, which greatly expands the kinds of facilities that can apply under this program. The reason that matters is, just as we've expanded this capacity, we went back to this rather modest amount of grant funding available. And so what I'm begging small ports to do this year, who are the most likely applicants under this program, is please apply. Even if you feel like you can't do a full application, please apply, because we need to understand what the need is. Again, it's always oversubscribed by a factor of 5. But this year, I suspect we'll get even more, although I know people are discouraged because the amount of money is not very significant. This is an opportunity to expand our ability to move freight for the nation by water, all kinds of freight. And I think it has been suggested that perhaps it should be managed in a similar kind of formulaic grant program as the highways are. That's not how it's being managed right now, but there's certainly an opportunity and a potential there. Moving on to our next grant programs that I'd like to talk about, small shipyard grants. So small shipyard grants have gotten a lot of press this year. Some of you might be following this. I got a lot of questions at testimony about it. And a lot of those questions were confusing it as if it were a program that awarded funding to military capacity yards. This is not targeted at military yards. This is targeted at yards that have less than 1,200 employees, that build or maintain vessels, and need to expand their workforce and also perhaps purchase additional equipment to give them additional capacity. We find that every grant that we award here tends to lead to about 20 new jobs, which of course is a key factor. But this is for small facilities that are maybe building support vessels for offshore wind or some other part of the industry. Fairleigh Boat Works and Newport News received one last year to buy some additional equipment. But these grants are awarded nationwide. Typically, there's about $20 million a year in the program. There could be more, once again, oversubscribed by a factor of 5. So lots of opportunities here. But again, funding is the challenge. I think thinking about this more broadly, and I talked about the national security impacts and capacity, one of the challenges that we face in the PIDP program, we're focusing on helping ports help themselves and fix things that need to be fixed, and improve their ability to move goods, improve their rail capacity, improve their road capacity, include their ability to maneuver cargo of whatever kind they have within their facility. But the other challenge that we're seeing, and the small shipyard grants kind of leads into it, is we do not have enough industrial capacity nationwide to build or maintain or repair our maritime industry more broadly. Certainly, there's two categories here, the large overseas, offshore, internationally trading vessels, and the smaller, typically smaller, Jones Act, so brown water, blue water, coastal trade, coastwise trade vessels. We within MARAD, even in maintaining our own vessels in the Ready Reserve Force, are competing with Navy, active duty, Military Sea Lift Command, Coast Guard, Army Corps, all for the same dry dock and maintenance capacity. And along with that, commercial industry, in some cases, many cases, is also competing for that capacity. Of course, active duty forces go first. So if it's a Navy ship or my ship, a Navy ship's going in, or an MSC vessel, they're going in first. What we're finding is that fewer and fewer yards have the capacity to work on larger vessels and have the capacity to build vessels. But just because you can maintain something doesn't mean you can build something new. So the reason all of this matters is if we're truly serious about expanding the resilience and capacity of our maritime industry broadly, ports, waterways, and shipping, we need to focus on building additional capacity here, not only on our ability to build and maintain vessels, but on our ability to handle cargo and our port infrastructure nationwide. And the challenge there is, we are a maritime nation, but we've never really taken this terribly seriously. And I think my teaser there is think about all the shipbuilding that we expanded capacity that we did to support World War I. After World War I, we let it all go. We built it all up again to support World War II. We built thousands of ships. After World War II, we let it all go. And so now we're down to 85 ships. Sounds like a pretty good number for a privately owned US flag, internationally trading vessels. Individual companies in China have more than 1,000. There are 31,500, plus or minus some number, internationally trading vessels owned by other nations or other private companies. We have 85. So if we're supposed to be carrying, by law, the majority of our foreign import and export commerce on US flag vessels, we're not doing it. We do about 2% on US flag. And most of that is driven by cargoes that they have to carry for DOD or other parts of the government. So a lot more to talk about there, just sort of a teaser, and I know some of that may have come up already this morning and possibly in Admiral Fogar's remarks or others, but the challenge here for us as a nation is, we're very focused on infrastructure, and I'm very focused on managing this Ready Reserve Force and improving its capacity to meet the nation's needs. But more broadly as a nation, where do we want to go here? What do we want to do long term? What are we really thinking about strategically? And I can tell you that from what I'm seeing with PIDP is that even the money we have, which sounds like a lot and it vastly outstrips anything we've ever invested in ports before. It's a drop in the bucket compared to need. And as a reminder, ports belong to states. There's not a national port infrastructure plan. I can't pick based on what I want to see happen with this area or that area based on a national freight plan that would help guide us. So that is a strategy, that is a process we are working towards. But right now, we take what we get, we use the criteria we have, and we make decisions and award based on that. So focused on the movement of goods and improving the movement of goods. And so it's an interesting strategy to think about long term. So I think having muddied the waters with the broader strategy of where do we want to be as a maritime nation, and cycling back to our work within the Maritime Administration to do what we can to foster, promote, and develop, and particularly in the context of port infrastructure. I'll stop, and I'm happy to take questions. Very different world than what I was just doing in the Commonwealth, but I can tell you that the coastal resilience piece is important, and a lot of the things we've learned here that we are trying to implement are familiar and ring true in the work that we're doing in the Maritime Administration today. So thank you all. Hi, Jennifer.
Admiral Phillips, Jennifer Palestrant. Good to see you.
Hi, Jennifer. Hello, ma'am.
I tell you what, the one thing that you didn't touch on is MARAD's work around workforce. And y'all are doing a lot of work in that area. So I thought maybe, do you want to take a minute and talk about what's happening with the academies and the Center of Excellence?
Certainly, we are struggling, as the rest of the country is struggling, to support a mariner workforce, a maritime workforce that is sufficient to meet our needs. You could put that into a couple different pieces. In my case, in particular, I'm focused on mariners, those who will sail, licensed or unlicensed. There is also a shortage of workers in the maritime industry broadly, at ports and working in other contexts and capacities in support of the industry. Within the maritime industry, as far as sailing on vessels, we convened last fall, I mean, again, I'm the foster, promote, and develop lady, a group of stakeholders, including our carriers, industry, labor, and the academies and other interested parties, to talk about our challenges with maritime labor and to try to come up with near and long-term options and opportunities to expand that capacity. We focused on a kind of a four-step process: recruit, train, retain, and reduce barriers. And in particular, then industry and other stakeholders kind of split themselves into four groups and have been working on each of those pillars. Within the Maritime Administration, I have limited capacity to spend money to move things forward here, other than the funding that I get, small amounts of funding that I give to the state academies and the new training vessels that they're going to get, which will be significant recruiting tools. And of course, our work at Kings Point to improve our capacity there, although their numbers have actually been going up slightly, which is a good thing. And we have a Centers of Excellence program designated within the Maritime Administration that talks about, specifically focuses on designating Centers of Excellence around the country in the maritime training context. The first year that we designated such centers was 2021. There were 27 named. We were about to name the next set in 2022, and the law changed, and so we have had to start over with that process this year to redesignate in 2023 so that we can make sure everybody that is an applicant follows the changes in the 2023 NDAA. However, since most people do, we think we'll be able to get that out more quickly. The nuance to this program is it's only a designation. You can go to MARAD's website, you can learn about these Centers of Excellence, but there was a grant program authorized to go with it, which would help us give them more capacity, but it was not appropriated. So I have no actual funding or help I can give them in that regard. We are also, and I should add this as very much an aside from the kinds of things we're thinking about today, but it does matter in the context of recruiting mariners, and that is focusing on improving the culture within the industry. The maritime industry has somewhat of a history of being a challenging place to work, and is, for those who have served on active duty, and probably about 40 years behind where the military is now as far as diversity, equity, and inclusion. You've probably seen some of the more public CNN reports on incidents that have occurred on vessels at sea, commercial vessels at sea, regarding harassing, bullying, or actually full-out assault regarding midshipmen or others. And so prior to my arrival, the case that is most widely known, Midshipman X, it was just in the paper a couple of weeks ago, and Ensign Hicks is now living in the Hampton Roads area and serving in the Navy. She went active duty. CNN interviewed her. She was actually on a live interview as well. So you probably know or are aware of her story, which occurred a few years ago. In 2021, in the fall, she wrote about a horrific incident that happened to her on board a U.S. flag vessel, commercial vessel, and that led to the Maritime Administration. My deputy was then acting administrator, Lucinda Leslie, and the department making a decision to shut down Sea Year, U.S. Merchant Marine Academy midshipmen train at sea on commercial vessels. The state academies typically do less of that. They train on training ships. And it was shut down for 6 weeks while they developed a program focused on every mariner building a respectful culture, and that is the name of the program. Embark, Every Mariner Builds a Respectful Culture. This, in effect, again, for those who've been on active duty, is a sexual assault prevention and response program. Nothing like that existed in industry, and now something like that exists in industry. And not only that, but it is law. In 2023, it was passed into law. And to give it some teeth, I had the ability to withhold payments from those vessels who receive stipends from me under the Maritime Security Program, Tanker Security Program, which is new, which we're putting together, we'll announce shortly, and a Cable Security Program, such that if they are not in compliance with the requirements of this program, which we are allowed to inspect, by the way, we may withhold their stipend. They receive a small stipend from the government to help them make their costs, which are of serving as a U.S. flag vessel. In addition to that, there are a series of actions that are required by companies, by vessels, and in addition to that, in the Coast Guard bill, many of the things that are required under Embark, having a managed key system for locks on doors in the vessel, cameras, having a sexual assault prevention and response coordinator and a point of contact where someone who feels they have been harassed or have some bullied in some or threatened or assaulted can make a report with not having to report it to the commanding officer if they don't want to. All of that is now in the Coast Guard Act, and it is in under Embark as well, under the NDAA. So these two things fit together. We work very closely with the Coast Guard. They are our law enforcement authority at sea, and they work closely with the Department of Justice because anything that must be, is considered to be of criminal nature must be handled by the Department of Justice. So all of that back to recruiting. If you want to recruit broadly, you need to have an environment where people want to be and are felt and valued based on their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and irrespective of their gender or their race. 7% of the maritime industry is women in this country. 54% of the population are women in this country. So if you want to go after, if you're missing half the population that you need to be sailing, then you want to create an environment where people may actually want to serve. I could tell you, having met plenty of young women who are sailing, they are eager to sail, they're enthusiastic about it, and they like what they're doing. But there are certainly a lot of distractors. So the entire program is basically focused on removing barriers so that we can encourage and expand our opportunities, which is a specific challenge within the maritime industry. Not only there, but a specific challenge within the maritime industry. So for those who've served, you've lived this, and you're probably still living it. I mean, the Navy's come a long way, but you'll never completely eliminate this. But what we've seen over the course of the past year within the Maritime Administration and within the industry is a realization that change, the time for change has come, and more and more focus on executing what needs to be done here and embracing this program. So way off topic from what we're doing here, but in the context of trying to improve and build and expand a workforce, you need to have an environment where people actually want to be and where they are valued for what they do and feel that they can do their job without being harassed. That's simple. Okay. Kay says one more.
One more? Okay.
Thank you. I don't know if this is an important enough question to be the last one, but Admiral Phillips, thank you. It's fascinating. A two-part question, but both about personnel. My impression for many years has been that we have a very difficult isometric exercise here because at the same time you're trying to get people into the profession, expand the American maritime presence. We have a whole body of important, socially desirable laws about wages and conditions and things which have resulted in there being a very, very small fleet of U.S. flagged ships. We have a much larger number of U.S.-owned ships, probably, but they're not U.S. flagged. And so, don't you have, in a sense, an isometric tension here between our social goals, which are important, I'm not denying them, and the need to expand the industry? And then as a sub-part of that, if you have to go to sea with a large part of your reserve ships, what's your situation on crews?
Well, I testified before the HASC 2 weeks ago, and when asked by Chairman Waltz if I thought I could man the ready reserve in time of crisis for a sustained, contested operation, I told him I did not think that I had enough manpower to do that. I still think that. And industry thanked me for saying that afterwards, so there you go. The tensions are interesting because of the nature of the way our fleet is put together, and if you really want, I mean, that's a question that would take probably a doctoral thesis to unpack. I think summing it up briefly, we don't really subsidize our industry, really. MSP, Maritime Security Program, provides a $5.3 million stipend to 60 vessels, militarily useful in support of the nation's needs. CSP is a $5 million stipend. TSP will be a $6 million a year stipend to cover the costs. Some question as to whether that's adequate or not. Fair enough, fairly enough. And I can tell you that the TSP number, which is $6 million a ship, we're bringing in 10 ships, is a 10-year-old number. So if just thinking about inflation alone, if it was whatever we intended 10 years ago, it's different now. And so is that the right number? I've been tasked to actually do a report on that in the NDAA. So that's part of the challenge. The other challenge is if we're really going to have a U.S. flag fleet, it's got to carry more than just DoD cargo, right? It's the beneficial cargo operators have to decide that they're going to sail U.S. flag. But to do that, they're going to have to pay more because of those labor laws, which are important. Other countries have them too. They subsidize. We don't. So not really. So that is where the tension comes in. And when I talk to my peers in other nations, well, first of all, they're stunned by a couple of things. One, they're stunned that we don't own the ports, that I don't own the ports. A lot of my colleagues in other countries have much more control over the port industry than we do. We have none, basically. But we have nice grants, good grants. Please apply. Nearly every nation has some additional way of ensuring that their mariners are cared for and are paid appropriately and valued for their service. So we value them, and the pay is good, but I think the inference that we can't compete because of our labor laws is not entirely correct. It depends on whose labor laws you're talking about. And it depends on which country you're bringing your mariners from and what their labor laws are or not. So certainly there are countries where people work for a whole lot less money, but are the conditions fair? And so that's the challenge. So we pay for that. We pay for that. But other nations do too. I think the difference with us is, could we do more? Are there more things that we could offer as incentives? And so to that, I defer to industry, who is working on, as a part of the task force that we started last fall and that they have carried on, what kinds of things could be options to give additional benefits, and which would be additional incentives to mariners. So lots more to be done there, but and happy to talk about the whole U.S. flag challenge at another time, because it's a long history of us saying one thing but then kind of doing another, so, as a nation. Thank you.